Hello and welcome to the Procedural Plots Guide for the Procedural City Generator 1.2.1. In this tutorial, we'll go over how to generate our plot shape. That means tracing and simplifying the shape, modifying the shape by hand, creating manual plots from scratch. We're going to generate and customize our sidewalks. We're going to learn how to spawn our props, and they're going to be edge, inner, and hierarchical instant static mesh props. We're going to look at how we can load prop data from a data table. We're going to look at how to flatten and apply materials to our landscape, and a few additional options like creating a 3D plot, which is an experimental feature, looking at corner offsets, and how to remove certain points. So let's go ahead and jump into Unreal. And as you can see here, I have a very simple sample level with a few roads. You want to go to Procedural City, Blueprints, Plots, and right here you see BP generated plot. That is the main blueprint class that creates those plots in between the rows. Now if you watch the quick start guide, you know that we can spawn these procedurally from the UI. So I'm not going to go over that process here. What I will go over are all of the different options once that plot has been spawned. So in this case, we're going to grab and drop our blueprint here into the middle space here, and we are going to go all the way down to the default section, and we're going to click on trace shape. And you can see from up here it almost looks like a solid line, but if I scroll all the way down, you'll see that we have a bunch of points along a spline. So obviously that is the resolution that we want, because we want to make sure that we are as accurate as possible with the shape. But from there, we want to click on Simplify the Spline, and you can see that automatically we have a lot less points. Then we're going to try to detect corners, and we're going to add corner points. You can see that we added these two here. That's going to be important for our sidewalks. Then we click on Adjust Points, and what that's going to do is going to try to fit those points more snugly on the shape. You can see that it moved a little bit down. And finally, when we're happy, we can click on Create Plot Mesh. If I go all the way down here, you can see that we have a plot. Simple enough. Now, we can actually modify the shape manually. So if you click on the plot, you'll see all these points. This is an actual spline, and if you click on any of the points and you move it, you can see that we are modifying that procedural shape. And obviously, it's kind of obvious here. It is selecting a random material from that area. So with the plot selected, we're going to go to the Setup Plot section here on the Details panel. And we're going to go over some of these settings here. By default, there's a height value of 25. Basically, that's the one I've determined that looks the best with the default roads, but you can change that. So let's make this like 50, for example. And you can see that automatically we see that our plot's height has increased. Let's make this like super obvious and make it like 100. And you can see that we have now a very, very tall plot. We also have plot materials. So if you expand this struct here, you'll see that we have two categories. We have a materials list and a manual material. So this material list is going to be used to procedurally and randomly grab one of those materials. So every time you modify the plot, it'll come and grab one of these materials here. So you can add as many materials as you want to this list. But if you want to use a manual material, which there's a separate button for that, then it'll use the specific material that we have here. So as you can see, we're going to modify this, go back to default, and you can see that it grabbed the material here on index 2 by default. Okay. Now let's say that we wanted to create a manual plot, because obviously this works by tracing a specific shape. You can do that, and I'm going to grab this generated plot here and drag it. But instead of tracing for a shape, I'll go down here and click on Manual Plot. And by default, it'll just create the shape with some corners. And at this point, I can just click create plot mesh. And you see that we have just a generic square. At this point, I can just add spline points just like I would normally. So right click, add spline point. And at this point, you can see that I can make whatever shape I want. So I'm going to click on add spline point here, make it a little bit bigger there, add spline point. There you go. In this way, you're not really dependent on the tracing ability. You can create a plot with any shape you want. So you can see here and modify all of the settings just the same. Okay. Now we're going to generate our sidewalks. So now we're going to click here on our plot. If you scroll all the way up to the generic setup options here, there is an option called generate sidewalk. And we're just going to tick this option here. And automatically you see that we have some sidewalks all around. And the sidewalks are a little bit different. This is a spline mesh. So I decided to do a separate method for the sidewalks because I wanted to give as many options as possible. So for the sidewalks themselves, they're going to go around. And I'm going to go down to the setup sidewalk section here. And you can see that we have several different things, including the sidewalk mesh, which by default is the one I'm using here. The segment length, that'll relate to how big is this mesh. And just like the plots, we're going to have some materials. We have base materials, which we're going to pick a random material from here. We have an experimental option called use middle materials. And you will only enable it if you click here. And then you have a separate option for middle materials. And then you have base, manual, and mill materials. These are the manual materials that you'll use if you use the manual's material option. So we'll look at materials in just a second. But for now, just as the plot, you have different options here. You have the width and the height scale. Instead of a flat value, that's going to be a scale based on the size of the mesh. By default, it's a width of 2 and a height scale of 1.4. So let's go ahead and change that. So let's say that we want a width scale of 4. That's going to make it more wide, basically. But for us to see the changes, we have to go back up there and untick generate sidewalk and click it again. And you can see now that we have a much wider sidewalk here. Same thing for the height. We're going to go back down here to the sidewalk section, and I'm going to make the height value, instead of 1.4, let's make it, I don't know, 3, for example. And again, we're going to go all the way up, uncheck generate sidewalk, check it again, and you can see that now we have much taller sidewalks. So you can play around with these values based on what you want to generate. You can change the settings separately for the sidewalks and for the plot itself, which is the middle here. There's going to be some additional options like the tangent length. That's going to be how sharp the corners are. And then this is going to be some more advanced options on how we detect a corner, which is going to have a dot angle of 0.5. And then for every single sidewalk segment, you're going to have a list of sidewalks here, which are going to be specific strokes. And just like the procedural roads, you can choose to hide or modify any of the individual segments here. One quick thing to keep in mind is that you're going to see sometimes that we have this little issue here where, because of the way the spline point is, you get like this little error. All you have to do is just grab the spline point nearby and just move it slightly, and you can see that it'll go away. So that happens occasionally. Unfortunately, you're gonna notice that. So scroll all the way up to the setup section and click on display spline numbers, and that way we can see what segments we're talking about. So let's say that I wanted to remove segment 21 from the sidewalk. So all I have to do is come back down to setup sidewalk, expand the sidewalk segments, and go to 21. And in this case, I can just select show segment, and I'm going to deselect it. and you can see that we now have a missing sidewalk. So later on, you'll realize why this is kind of important. This is the similar method that we use to cut the sidewalk when we're doing driveways. But also if you create a, let's say like a little park or an industrial area that doesn't have any buildings and you want to have an explicit entrance without a sidewalk, then you can do that as well. Notice that it's not limited to just showing or hiding the segment. You can modify the static mesh and the materials themselves, and you can even modify the start and end scale. Okay, now let's look at how to spawn our props. So with your plot selected, go ahead and scroll down all the way to setup/props, and we're going to expand it here. And you can see that we have several different categories of props. We have edge props, inner props, and HISM props, which are going to be the hierarchical instant static mesh props. And they're going to have similar settings, so we're going to expand the edge prop list. And by default, you see that we have 3 different props that are going to be spawned on the edges, and we're going to be using the same spline that you see here. So for example, we have this little bollard here. You have the option of spawning an actor class, a blueprint class, or a static mesh. You have the bounds, you have a scale range, min and max. You can add a rotation. You can add a prop placement spacing. This is going to be the spacing between that prop. In this case, by default, is 500. You have a % chance to spawn. You can align it to the surface if we're doing something that is not flat. There's a floor offset option. You can make a positive or negative offset. And also the edge offset. That is the distance in from the edge towards the inside or outside. And whether it can spawn on a sidewalk. The sidewalk would mean the actual mesh, spline mesh of the sidewalk here. Some props you may want to have spawn in random locations, but not on the actual sidewalk mesh itself. So you can see that we have options like this. For inner props, they're meant to be spawned inside, but not on the sidewalks. And again, by default, we're going to expand here. We have a statue, and in this case, it's going to be a blueprint. And you can see that we have similar options here, like collision bounds, scale range. You do have an option here to spawn in the center. And if you do that, then you're probably going to only spawn one of these items here. So we want this statue that only has 30% chance to spawn exactly in the center of the shape. And if I expand another one, you have another example of trees. In this case, it's going to be a static mesh. Not spawn in the center with an offset of -10. That way kind of sinks into the ground. And it has a % chance to spawn of 1. And you can see that we have a spawn range. It's going to be between 8 and 15. So every time you spawn inner props, we're going to spawn between 8 and 15 of these trees scattered around inside. And finally, the HISM prop list. In this case, we also have 3 by default. So we have this little grass mesh, and you're going to have the same thing. Number of spawns, in this case, is going to be 2,000. Bounds, scale range, and then whether you want to apply a random yaw, align it to the surface. There's going to be a floor offset here, and whether it can spawn on the sidewalks or not. So the HISM prop list is meant for things like grass, flowers, things that are not going to have collision, and you need to spawn in the thousands. So that is the reason why we have a separate category here. So really quickly, let's just go down all the way here, and we're going to first start by spawning the HISM props. You always start with those, and I'm going to click here. And you may not see anything, so I'm going to have to go all the way down here. And you can see that we have some grass meshes and some flower meshes here. So I'm going to click again. And you can see how now we have more grass meshes. So if you are using a landscape, it probably doesn't make sense for you to do this. But if you're using a regular floor mesh and you don't have grass, then that may be a nice way of adding your own grass. Then we go for the edge props. Once we're happy with the HISM props, and we click here once, And you can see that the edge props have spawned the bullards here at a distance of 500. And we also have these lights that are facing inside. And you can see that we have a separate offset for these. And finally, let's go ahead and spawn the inner props. So we go to spawn inner props right here, 3C, and we click once. And you can see that we have some trees that are scattered around. We even have some benches. And we can keep clicking as many times as we want. So we can click inner props again. And we add some more trees. And these are separate actors. So you can click on one of these trees, for example, and you can move it anywhere you want. So you're not stuck with the actual setup, kind of the final result here. You can freely move your props anywhere you want to give that kind of plot that final look. So you can see here that obviously we're selecting random locations within the volume, so we can just kind of play around with the locations here. And finally, let's go ahead and use our manual materials. And if you recall, the sidewalks themselves and the plot themselves have a separate slot for a manual material. So if you click here on set manual mats, you're going to see that we're going to use the manual material that was assigned for the inner plot, which is like this grass texture here, and the sidewalk has this light texture. So you can see here that just in a couple of clicks, we created a potential little mini park in the middle of the city. And if you recall from the quick start guide, if you want to use one of your plots to create a park, before you spawn your buildings, you can come here and click on can spawn buildings and deselect this option here. And what that's going to do, so you can see here, it's going to show you with this red material that when you're generating your buildings in your city, this plot will not allow any buildings to spawn. And the reason you would want to do that is because you may want to create a little park like this. So once you generate your buildings, you come up to the plot again and deselect can spawn buildings. That way you remove that texture here, and then you can do this as we just did here. Notice that we can, by selecting the plot itself, we actually have all of those separate props are nested within the plot here, so everything's quite organized. And if you're not happy with this setup, you can always delete your props. So we can go all the way down here and click on remove props, and all of the props will be removed and you can start over. All right, now we're going to look at how to use data tables to customize our plots. That includes not only the props that we load, but also some settings for the plots and the sidewalks themselves. So if you go to the setup section here, you'll notice that we have a checkbox saying use data table. And if you expand the data table row, we have a data table here and different rows here. So if you click on the icon here, you'll navigate to the data table. We're going to double click to open it. And just like the city zones, we have different rows, like in this case, building plot, city park, empty lot. And each individual row will have settings that we're going to load to our plots. Things like the plot materials, and you'll see that we have the exact same struct, sidewalk materials, sidewalk scale and height scale, the width and height scale rather. We have edge props, inner props, and HISM props. So because it is a data table, you can always click on add and add your own custom settings for the plot. And that way you can very quickly customize your plots. So in this case, you can see that we go back here and by default it's called building lot. But I can come here and say, actually, I want a city park. And I can select the row here for city park. And if we go back here, you can see that the city park has the settings, including the grass. So that's kind of what we did that. So let's just actually select something else. So that was kind of the city park. Let's do something like construction. Just make it different and scroll all the way down and click on load data table. That will automatically load all of the settings. And now, without doing anything else, we can click on Spawn Edge Props, Spawn Inner Props, and you can see that we have that's there. And in this case, let's go ahead and click on Set Random Materials. In this case, we don't want to use the manual materials. And you can see that we have kind of this concrete setup here. And if I zoom down here, you can see that we have even a vehicle that spawned. This is supposed to be kind of a construction site. So you can see here where we have some trash, we have some crates, we have this little thing here, and some vehicles. Maybe you're unhappy with that and you can just remove the props. Let's load up a separate setting here. Let's scroll all the way up, and instead of construction, let's do something like helipad. Very specific one. And again, load data table, and then we can go and see, do we have any edge props? And in this case we do for the setup, and you can see that we have similar setup here with the bollards and the lights. And we do spawn inner props, and you can see that in this case we actually spawned little helicopter here with this little landing area. So you can see that we can quickly customize the plots by using the data table. Now we're going to remove the props and leave it like this. Now we're going to look at how we can flatten and apply materials to a landscape. If I zoom all the way down here, you'll notice that we have some grass that is poking through our plot, and that is because the landscape here obviously has some grass meshes that are a little bit taller than our plot. So in this case, you wouldn't want all this grass popping up. So in this case, the easiest thing to do would be to apply a material layer all around our plot that would remove that grass mesh. So one thing we can do is we can just click. Actually, let's do it here on one of these sections here, where you can see that we have a little kind of area here. So we're going to browse to the asset. We're going to drop our generated plot mesh here. And in this case, we're going to put it on the flat area. We're going to align it to the flat area. And then we're going to move it kind of to the middle here. And you'll see that it's kind of overlapping, which is fine. We're going to trace the shape. It's going to do the exact same thing as before. Simplify, add corners, adjust, and then we're going to create our plot mesh. And you can see that we have a little problem here. We have the mesh aligned to the roads, but we have this little mountain that is kind of coming over our plot. So we can align the landscape by using a spline. Now this is considered experimental. If you have a plot that is like a very hard shape like this, a rectangle, then it should work pretty well. But if you have an irregular shape, like in this case, you have like this little island, it won't work as well. So what we do is, in this case, we're going to the setup landscape section here. We're going to select our landscape. In this case, it's going to be this one here. Then you click on raise and lower. These options are going to basically flatten the terrain, apply the spline, and either raise or lower it. If you do not select these two options, this will only apply the material. So in this case, we do want to flatten the terrain, so we select these options. Then we go down and click on Align Landscape. As you can see, there's a spline that has been made from front to the back, and then with a specific width of the plot. Now this works really nicely for plots that are a rectangular shape, but if you have plots that are more like this little island here, it's not going to be as effective. So keep that in mind. If you have a custom shape like this in a regular shape, you may have to just use the actual flattening tools in the landscape mode itself. All right, and now one last thing, because you can see that we need to update the material. We can open the material instance and just make a small change, save it, and that'll force the material to be rebuilt, as you can see. So now you can see that we have no grass here, and the terrain has been completely flattened. Now we could do another option, which is what I've actually done in the showcase level, which is we don't need to flatten the terrain at all. So in this case, let's say that we wanted to show the sidewalk. we can just come up here and say generate sidewalk, and it'll just generate the sidewalk as expected. But let's say that we actually don't want to flatten the terrain. We can just do the same thing as before. Click trace shape, simplify the spline, add corner points, adjust, and then we can create the plot. But in this case, instead of creating the plot, what we can do is we can actually generate the sidewalks and deselect generate the plot. And what we've effectively done is we've only added the sidewalks here, as you can see here, and left the middle of the plot to use the landscape material, which of course will include the actual slope and everything here. So keep that in mind. Those are our options as well when it comes to dealing with landscapes. And now we're going to look at some additional options. The first one will be how to create a 3D plot. So we're going to once again drag our generated plot. We're going to do it here into this spot right here where we used to have our little island. And instead of just tracing for the shape, I'm going to grab this road here. I'm just going to select this spline point here. I'm just going to erase it to see that we have a road that is not perfectly flat. Now, this is obviously the case if you're using landscapes and you have roads that are not in a flat plane. Now we're going to select our generated plot, and here we're going to setup, and we're going to select create 3D plot, and you'll see that it is clearly marked as experimental. So when we select this option, we're actually not using geometry scripting, which is a lot more battle tested and stable. We're instead reverting to a different method that uses the procedural mesh component. So it is experimental because you may have to play around with the final shape to get it to have the proper contour, and you may even have to play around to get those collision settings correctly. So the process is still the same. You click on create 3D plot, and then we scroll all the way down, and we do the same thing that we've done before. We'll trace for the shape, and if I go all the way down here, you can see that we are indeed tracing for the shape of the road here. We're going to simplify it. Oops. And finally, we're going to create the plot mesh. And you can see that we do indeed have a 3D shape. It's not exactly perfect, but it is indeed a 3D shape. So if I look underneath, you can see that we have a 3D shape. So that is the way you would create a plot that has a 3D shape. And obviously, if you want to see the sidewalks themselves will also generate correctly because they are following that spline. And you can see in this case, the plot is a little bit higher than the sidewalk. So the way you would fix that, if you really wanted to go with this method, is you would go to the sidewalk options here and simply make the height scale a little bit taller. Let's say 2, for example. And then you go back and regenerate the sidewalks. And you can see that now they are showing a little bit more. The next option will be to look at the corner offset. So if we select one of the plots here and scroll all the way down to setup plot, you'll see that we have a value here called corner low offset. In this case, it's going to be a -20. And let's see exactly what it does. If I come here and I see what a corner looks like, maybe one of these, and just to make it more obvious, I'm going to remove these 2 spline points here. And then I'm going down here and I'm going to click on lower sidewalk corners. You'll see that this point here on the corner just went lower. So if I go back and refresh my sidewalk here, you'll see that now we have a corner that has been lowered. I'm gonna make my camera a little bit slower, and you can see a lot of the cities will have this where the corners when the pedestrians are going to pass it's a little bit lower. So you can see that we do have that option for your corners, and you can of course change that offset number to whatever you want. In this case, -20 seemed to be a good value, but if this is too much, you can make it like -10 or something. Another thing that you can do is basically revert this. So let's say that you're tracing an irregular terrain. Maybe you have this a little bit lower like this, and you have something different. You can always come back here and click on, where is it? Reset sidewalks. Oh, sorry, reset sidewalk height. And let's look at the points here. And we can click on reset sidewalk height. It'll make all of the points the exact same height as they were before. And then you can go back and again, refresh the generation, generate sidewalk. And you can see that now we are back to square one. And finally, we want to make sure that we look at an option to remove certain points from the spline. So let's go ahead and first display our spline numbers here. And you can see that we have a bunch of spline numbers here. Let's say for whatever reason, when you're tracing an irregular shape, the trace does an incorrect shape, and you need to remove a certain amount of points. Let's say that there's a bunch of points here that went into the road, and you need to eliminate between 26 and 30. Instead of manually right-clicking on every single point, you can actually do that procedurally. And what you do is you come down here to the plot section again, set up plot, and you'll see that we have a start and an end call point. So in this case, we'll say, let's see, 25 to 31. In a quick example here. And then we go down there and click on remove points. And you can see that we have removed the points from here all the way there. And of course, it will not refresh until you come down here and then click on refresh. So we're gonna generate the plot again and generate the sidewalk again. And now we have our new shape. All right, that is all for this guide. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Or if you want to talk to me directly, join our Discord and DM me for any help or comments that you may have. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys in the next video.